Well, good morning, everybody. Glad you came here today. Good to have you here. You know, we set a record last week, the number of people who were here. And, we're, I don't know, we're counting today too. So we'll see how many we have. But, Jan, thank you for praying for us so regularly as you do. I can't tell you how many times as a pastor I wished I had a whole congregation of people like Jan who would pray like that. Just, what a gift that is. And I've been asked to announce that there's a table back here with some vegetables, some corn, and some tomatoes there, and that's contributed by Ron and Lori Vincent, and that's a gift. Some people have tried to give them some money, but they said, don't give them any money, just put it in the Coats for Kids thing as a donation. So that's their request. I got to say, as a speaker, it made me a little nervous to see a box of ripe tomatoes over there. So I'm kind of glad they explained the nature of that, but if anybody's so inclined, bring it on. I only got one, but you never know who you're gonna get. All right, well, if you've been a Christian for any length of time at all, and most of us certainly have, we tend to think that we've got this thing called Christianity pretty much figured out. We do, don't we? I mean, we've been around the block maybe a couple of times, and so we know what faith is all about. We still go to church because we know that we need to be reminded of some things that we would otherwise forget, and because we know that it's good for us to hang out with other Christians, and because we know that we were made by God to worship God. And we attend Bible studies like this one because we know that we can always learn something more, even at our advanced age, and because the coffee here is as good as it is at Starbucks, and better, and cheaper, although it's not free. Okay. And we still do our daily devotions, and we pray because we just want to stay in touch with God and God's will for us. But at our age, there just isn't that much that we haven't seen before, right? There's always more we can learn, but let's face it, we're pretty much in the know when it comes to things Christian. We started last week a study on the Apostle Paul and his companions, a study called Paul and Company. And we know all about Paul too, don't we? And we know that he started out as a bad guy named Saul, who was mean to Christians, just about as mean could be. But then one day when he was walking from Jerusalem to Damascus and had just about reached his destination, Saul met Jesus, the risen Jesus, on the road, and was struck blind when he saw and heard Jesus. We know that a few days later, to use Luke's words, that something like scales fell from Saul's eyes, and that he then regained his sight. And we know that Saul soon then, thereafter, became Paul, and a really good guy who wrote a lot of the New Testament. We know all about Paul, don't we, as a part of our faith. We're studying Paul again because that's what Christians do, now and then. But we all know the story. But guys, can I say that the fact of the matter is that brief little sketch of Paul's life that I just gave you is a simplistic one at best and a wrong one at worst. Fact is, there's a lot more to Paul than most of us have ever known. And one of the things that we need to know most about Paul, listen friends, I talked about this last week, but it's important enough for me to talk about it again just a little bit today. What we all need to know about Paul is that he was a man who was willing enough and humble enough and smart enough, basically, to let other people into his life. And folks, something, that's a huge deal. I mean, it really is. If you were here last week, you'll remember, I hope you'll remember, that one of the things that Paul eventually learned about himself was that he needed others to be around him, because when he didn't have those other people around him, when he acted alone, when he did things all by himself, he was a very misguided, but worse yet, a very dangerous man. And in fact, that realization on his part, that he needed others around him, was a big part of Paul's transformation, just a huge part of his conversion experience. And what I want to do today is to take that lesson from last week a step further and say just a little bit, well, okay, quite a bit, about how Paul also eventually learned that he not only needed others around him for companionship, but how he sometimes needed some of those others to actually help him. By the way, that didn't come easily for Paul. He was used to doing things on his own, all by himself, with little or no help. One of the lessons that Paul had to learn, and he learned it the hard way, I guess, like a lot of us perhaps, is that he needed others both for companionship and for help. So I want to tell you about 4 of those times today. Look at the first of those times, please, with me. Turn to Acts chapter 9. Acts chapter 9. You know, we read a part of this chapter, first 9 verses last week. It's an important chapter, of course, because it's the story of Saul's conversion. Let me remind you, by the way, if I might, just briefly, of the arrangement that we reached last week, of the agreement that we made, which is to say that when I say Paul, and I really mean Saul, you'll know that. Okay? And when I say Saul, and I really mean Paul, you'll know that. And in fact, just to make the whole thing easier, let's just say that you'll know exactly what I mean at all times, no matter what I say. All right? Anyway, we're going to backtrack just a little bit right now and look at verses 7 through 9 of that 9th chapter. The men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They heard the sound of Jesus' voice when Jesus appeared to Saul on the road, but they did not see anyone. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand into Damascus. And for 3 days he was blind and did not drink anything. I guess what I want to know, friends, is if you see here in these words what I see here in these words. I mean, look at what's there in black and white. Look at it carefully and put it together with what we already know about Paul. It's an amazing picture. It really is. I wonder if you see what I see. Here's a man, a young man. We're told in Acts chapter 7, no more than 30 years old at most. I'm thinking maybe even younger than that. A young man on a mission, pretty much a solo mission, to basically wipe out the church just as the church is getting started. He gets permission, Saul does, to do what he wants to do from Caiaphas, who's the high priest at the time. And for some reason, we don't know exactly why, but it made sense to Saul at the time. For some reason, he decides to start his work in Damascus, which, as you know, is in present-day Syria, about 140 miles or so northeast of Jerusalem. His goal, Saul's goal, is to hunt down Christians in Damascus, men and women, and to take them back to Jerusalem and put them into jail. That's who he is, that's where he's going, that's what he's doing. But then, of course, we all know the story. Saul, meets Jesus, the risen Jesus, on the road when he's almost all the way to Damascus. And these verses from Acts 9, verses 7 through 9 of Acts 9 tell us what comes next. Luke tells us, remember, Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke, is also the writer of the book of Acts. Luke says, some men with Saul who stand there speechless, or you probably could say basically they're dumbfounded because they hear a sound, but they don't recognize that sound as Jesus' voice. And at the very same time, they see Saul, the leader of their group, sprawled on the ground in front of them. Saul is somehow able to get up without their help, but he can't see. So they, the men who are there with Saul, how many men were there, we have no idea, but at least a couple, they together lead Saul by the hand the rest of the way into the city of Damascus. Now, folks, I don't know about you, but I'm just fascinated by this picture. And I wonder if you see how entirely bizarre this must have seemed when it happened. Get this picture in your mind. A young man, presumably at the peak, the absolute peak of his physical strength, who is seemingly healthy in every possible way. A young man on a mission, a young man with the authority to do what he wants to do, is all of a sudden barely able to stand up, and he can't see a thing. Just like that. He becomes so completely and utterly helpless that he allows other men under his command. He really has no choice to take him by the hand like he was a child and to escort him into Damascus, which must have been, I'm thinking, a tremendously humiliating experience for Saul. I mean, think about it. A man with a lot of power and a lot of authority, in a matter of just minutes, finds himself at a point where he has to acknowledge his sudden helplessness and where he needs to let others hold his hand as if he were a child. All his self-sufficiency as a powerful man is gone. Now within minutes, he's entirely dependent on others for virtually everything. That's the picture. Now you might think that Paul would have wanted to forget what happened that day. I don't know about you. I'm pretty sure that I wouldn't have told that story on myself very far and wide. I probably would have kept that experience to myself. But look quickly forward, if you will, to Acts chapter 22. Acts 22, verse 11. Where Paul himself admits, Acts 22:11, he says, "My companions led me by the hand into Damascus, because the brilliance of the light had blinded me." Paul, in other words, in his own words, acknowledged what had happened that day. There is apparently no hesitancy and no shame in admitting what had happened. Turn back now, please, to Acts chapter 9, where Paul allows himself, again, he really has no choice, in a very interesting story, to be helped a second time. Follow along as we pick up the story with the 10th verse. In Damascus, Luke writes, there was a disciple named Ananias. And the Lord called to him in a vision, "Ananias." "Yes, Lord," he answered. The Lord told him, "Go to the house of Judas on Straight Street and ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul, for he is praying. In a vision, he has seen a man named Ananias come and place his hands on him to restore his sight." "Lord," Ananias answered, "I've heard many reports about this man and all the harm he's done to your holy people in Jerusalem, and he has come here with authority from the chief priests to arrest all who call on your name." But the Lord said to Ananias, "Go. This man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. I will show him how much he must suffer for my name." Then Ananias went to the house and entered it, placing his hands on Saul. He said, "Brother Saul, the Lord, Jesus, who appeared to you on the road as you were coming here, has sent me so that you may see again and be filled with the Holy Spirit." And immediately something like scales fell from Saul's eyes, and he could see again. He got up and was baptized, and after taking some food, he regained his strength. Now, those, of course, are Luke's words in the book of Acts. And you might think that Paul would want to keep that story under wraps, that he kind of want to be a little hush-hush about that one as well. But again, rather than trying to sweep that story under the rug, a story that makes Paul seem pretty weak and pretty helpless, Paul himself, again, acknowledges what happened. Turn back, again, please, to Acts chapter 22. We're wearing out your Bibles here today. 9:22. Turn back to chapter 22, verse 12, where Paul gives his own version of that story, which is exactly like Luke's version. "A man named Ananias came to see me," he says. These are Paul's words. "He was a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all the Jews living there. He stood beside me and said, 'Brother Saul, receive your sight.' And at that very moment, I was able to see him." Now, we're dealing with Paul in this study and with the ones who were his closest companions. This is a study about Paul and company, but let's look at Ananias just for a second, shall we? What you need to know, gang, is that there were actually 3 men in the Bible named Ananias. And the deal is that, interestingly enough, all 3 of those Ananiases, is that the way you would say it? Ananias? I don't know. All 3 of those men named Ananias, interestingly enough, are found in the book of Acts. The first Ananias appears in the 5th chapter of Acts. We're not going to go there right now because this is not about that particular Ananias, but it is an interesting story if you want to turn there, Acts chapter 5. Anyway, it's in that 5th chapter of Acts where you will find the story there about a man named Ananias and his wife Sapphira. An interesting story where they both literally fall over dead pretty much within hours of each other. Basically, why? Because they lied about a contribution that they said that they had made to the church. Now, the fact of the matter is that they did make a contribution to the church, but it wasn't as large a contribution as they said. So the only reason I'm telling you this is that the next time that you're filling out your tax forms, you might want to keep that in mind to make sure that you gave what you say you gave, okay, to the church. That's kind of important, just saying. The third Ananias was the high priest, who's mentioned in the 23rd and 24th chapters of Acts. And we're not talking about him either. We're concerned today, you and I, with the second Ananias who's mentioned in Acts chapter 9 and 22. And I think about this particular Ananias. This second Ananias, and how he must have felt when God called him by name and told him to go and see Saul. Now listen, I don't know about you. I've never actually heard God call my name, at least not audibly, or if he did, I wasn't paying attention at the time. But this Ananias, whom Luke tells us was a Christian, heard God call his name out loud. And I'm thinking that when Ananias heard God call his name, that perhaps Ananias wished that he hadn't. Because the deal is that God asked him to do something that, in all honesty, was kind of a disagreeable thing to do. It was not a very easy thing to do at all, which was to pay a visit to the notorious Saul. For some reason, Ananias wasn't all that excited about going to Judas's house on Straight Street, a different Judas, by the way, than the one in the Gospels. And I don't know about you, but I can't say that I blame him. He didn't want to talk to Saul, this Ananias, or lay hands on him, touch him. Why would he want to do that? Or have anything at all to do with Saul, because Saul had a reputation when it came to dealing with Christians, and it wasn't a good one, to say the least. Luke reports what Ananias said. But I'm wondering if Luke tells us everything. I'm thinking that maybe Ananias might have said something like, "Are you absolutely sure, Lord, that you have the right Ananias, even though there are other Ananiases out there?" But the thing is, you don't get very far by arguing with God. Have you noticed that? Again, here's what I found. When God calls your name, whether you actually hear him or just maybe feel that tug of God on your heart, you might just as well give in and say yes right away, because God's going to keep calling your name until you answer. You know he is. God doesn't make mistakes. He never talks to the wrong Ananias. And folks, here's the bottom line. Saul needed help that day. And he let Ananias help him. Let's continue the story with the last part of the 19th verse in Acts chapter 9 through I think about the 25th verse. Now Saul spent several days with the disciples in Damascus. And once he began to preach in the synagogues that Jesus is the Son of God. All those who heard him were astonished and asked, "Isn't he the man who raised havoc in Jerusalem among those who call on his name? And hasn't he come here to take them as prisoners to the chief priests?" Yet Saul grew more and more powerful and baffled the Jews living in Damascus by proving that Jesus is the Messiah. After many days had gone by, there was a conspiracy among the Jews to kill him. But Saul learned of their plan. Day and night they kept close watch on the city gates in order to kill him, but his followers took him by night and lowered him in a basket through an opening in the wall. When I was a third grader, my church gave me a Bible. It happened in the Sunday worship service, and I mean, it was a big deal. It was a big church, and there was a lot of baby boomers in that church like me, and so, the whole third grade class in that church, there must have been 30 of us, we stood up there, and we got our Bibles. It was a rite of passage. And in the back of my third grade Bible, I don't have that Bible anymore, I don't know what happened to it, but I remember it clearly. In the back of that Bible, there were, of course, all kinds of maps of the Holy Land. You have to have those in the back of every Bible. Some of them with red and blue and green lines showing all of Paul's 3 missionary journeys. And along with those maps, you also had a whole lot of pictures of Bible characters. There were several pictures of Jesus, of course. Probably more Jesus than anybody else, but also pictures of Moses and David and Daniel and all the rest. And of course, they weren't pictures. Kodak didn't exist back then. They were reproductions of famous paintings. But the one picture I remember most of all, seriously, the one picture I remember as clearly as if it were yesterday was one of Paul being lowered to the ground outside the walls of Damascus in a basket. And I found it online, I think. There it is. I hope you can see it. That's the exact picture that was in the back of my Bible. As a third grader, as an 8-year-old, I got to say that it did not register with me at the time that the men lowering Paul in a basket that night were saving Paul's life, or even maybe saving the church by saving Paul. More than anything else, as an 8-year-old, I was just fascinated by the image of a man in a basket. I wonder if Paul thought it was fun to be swinging back and forth in a basket. I wonder how Paul got in the basket in the first place, or if Paul thought it was strong enough to hold him, or if the rope was strong enough to hold him, or if the guys on the other end were strong enough, to let him down. It never even occurred to me how important that night was as far as the Christian faith was concerned. And later on, I began to wonder if perhaps you could say that Paul was the very first basket case. Excuse me. Don't say that one again. Okay. But I also wonder, I really do wonder if Paul gave any thought at all to just how much had happened to him in such a relatively short period of time. True, Luke says that many days had gone by before Paul's friends saved him by lowering him in a basket. But it really wasn't all that long. I mean, he was still in Damascus after all. I don't know about you, but I wonder if maybe Paul wondered about what kind of mess had he gotten himself into in such a short time, and maybe whether or not he should have ever gone to Damascus in the first place. I mean, almost overnight, Paul had gone from being a tough man, a kind of man's man, I'm thinking, a man who was strong enough and who had all the power and all the authority to do just about anything that he really wanted to do, now losing his eyesight, being led by the hand into town, letting somebody else he didn't even know lay hands on him to restore his eyesight, and then finally sitting like a kid in a basket while a few friends lowered it to the ground. I mean, I'm thinking, maybe you're thinking too, that an awful lot had happened to Paul in just a short period of time, and it was all because he saw Jesus, when he never even thought that he would see Jesus, and certainly didn't even want to see Jesus. But the deal is that his friends became his enemies, and his enemies became his friends. And now here he was dangling in a basket. So much happened so quickly with Paul. And then finally, Paul needed help a fourth time. And to tell you the truth, it's a part of Paul's story that a lot of us haven't even heard. Or if we heard it, we often forget. But Paul himself talks about it. Turn, please, to Galatians now. This is Paul's letter to the Galatians, his own words. Galatians chapter 1, verses 11 to 20. Galatians 1, starting with the 11th verse. Remember, these are Paul's words now. This is Paul's story. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preached is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people, and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in me, so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, my immediate response was not to consult with any human being. I did not go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before I was, but I went into Arabia. Later, I returned to Damascus. Then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas, another name for Peter. Get acquainted with Cephas and stayed with him 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. I assure you before God that what I am writing you is no lie. It's in these 10 verses, friends. You'll miss it if you don't look at them carefully. It's in these verses where Paul talks about who he was before he met Jesus, and then who he turned out to be after he had met Jesus, and then about what he felt that he needed to do in order to get up to speed with what he believed God was telling him to do with the rest of his life. Look at verses 16 through 19 that we just read. He could have very easily said, Paul could have very easily said to himself that he's going to go to where all the action was back then, Which back then, as far as the Christian faith was concerned, was, of course, Jerusalem. He could have said, that's where I'm going. That's where all the great evangelists go. But he didn't do that, did he? No, without consulting anybody, he makes that point. Without talking to anybody at all, he did not go to Jerusalem, where all the leaders of the church just happened to be, but he went instead straight to Arabia, which back then was probably not what we think of as Arabia, but rather an area east of the Jordan River, but which was still very much a backwater place as far as the Christian faith was concerned. Very much kind of a nowhere place. Now, we don't know exactly how much time Paul spent in Arabia. But he went from there, even then, not to the bright lights of Jerusalem, but back to Damascus. Of all places. And I'm wondering if he thought maybe he'd get another basket ride, But all this, look at it closely, all this happens before his ministry gets kicked into high gear. Friends, here's the deal. A God-sized mission is not something that you can do overnight. That's pretty much basically my main point today. Let me say it again. A God-sized mission is not something that you can do overnight. It takes time and patience and preparation. It involves going to the right places, talking to the right people, but not to everybody. And listen, it involves taking your time. When I was 15 years old, as best I can recall, I, for the first time, felt that God was calling me into ministry. And I accepted that call, pretty much anyway. I thought about doing a few other things over the next several years, but I kept getting these messages from God, some of them about as subtle as a hit on the head with a 2x4, because I'm a little dense sometimes. But I kept getting these messages where eventually I knew that I wouldn't be satisfied with my life unless I did what God was telling me that he wanted me to do. And the thing is that as far as I was concerned, I was pretty much ready right then at 15 years old when God called me. He called me then. I figured, all right, God, let's do it. After all, I had preached in my church on a youth Sunday, and if I do say so myself, I pretty much nailed that. Everybody came up to me and said I was a fine young man. They really appreciated me saying what I said. So I just knew I was ready. But the authorities in my denomination told me that I had to go to seminary. Oh, and then, by the way, you couldn't go to seminary until first you graduated from college. And, I couldn't get into college unless I went to high school 3 more years. But that wasn't all. After 3 more years of high school and 4 years of college and 3 years of seminary, I was then told that I had to read some more books. After I thought I had read every book ever printed, And then they told me that I had to take some psychological tests to prove that I wasn't crazy. They were making me crazy. But I took the test and passed. And then I still had some more papers to write. And then finally, I had some interviews to endure, all before they would ordain me as a pastor. It took me 10 years, at least 10 years, to be what I wanted to be. Now listen, I'm not a great example by any stretch of the imagination, and I hesitate to speak of myself at all as any sort of model. I really do. But I had to learn. And I did learn that a God-sized mission is not something that you can do right away. Not something you can do as soon, perhaps, as you want to do it. No, it takes time and patience and preparation. Going to the right places, talking to the right people. And the fact is that Saul knew that. See, Saul was a lot smarter than I was. He was smart enough to figure that out on his own. Nobody had to tell him that. He just knew it. He knew that he needed, more than anything else, some time away with the right people to get ready to do everything that God was calling him to do. Basically, he needed people to help him. People in Arabia, where it seems to me Paul put himself through a kind of a training period, or you might even say kind of an apprenticeship time, where before he could get on with doing what he really wanted to do, he needed that time of preparation. He just needed to do that. So here's the deal, gang. Paul needed others in his life. Not just for companionship or friendship, but to help him. He needed them, and he needed to let them help him. He needed men to take him by the hand, to literally take him by the hand as an adult for his own sake. He needed a stranger named Ananias to heal him. He needed some strong men with a rope and a basket to save his life. And he needed other people here and there, even in backwater places like Arabia, to educate him and to get him ready to do everything that God wanted him to do. Paul needed others. He needed others to help him. And just so you don't miss the point, so do we. Talk around your tables, I'll come back.